Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good day. I just wanted to make this presentation because I have had a few students talk to me about how they find note taking a little bit difficult. And so I thought it would be important to sort of go through two types of note taking, the most common that I at least use, and the majority of people, I would argue, use, and the best methods for how to take notes. So, with that said, let's talk about the two types of note taking methods. I'm not too sure what these are called, but I call them either highlight centric notes or long notes. So highlight centric notes would be something like a PDF, an e-textbook, something that's on your laptop or your desktop that's all electronic that you're just like highlighting in like Preview or Adobe. And then with long notes, that would be closer to either like lecture or if it's a physical or like actual textbook, and you have to make essentially notes that way. So let's talk about the fundamentals of highlight centric notes. So, some things to keep in mind is that these notes are just for you, and essentially, these notes should be making sense to you. So, if the example that I'm giving you, you don't really vibe with it, you're not a fan, that's okay. Figure out something that does work for you, but I'm just giving you this option as like a starting point. So, I usually color code things. So, yellow would be general information that should be noted, things that just sort of stuck out to me. Maybe I want to like make a comment on it. Purple, whoops, not purple. Pink would be important points I want to comment on, especially in like class or discussion, maybe in an essay, etc., etc. Blue is going to be for foundational information. So, for example, if this author is talking about this concept over and over and over again, or like the entire article is based off this one foundational piece of information, it's going to be blue. And then anything that's going to be green is going to be a definition. So generally, the telltale sign is if blank is defined as, and then they go ahead and define it, it's automatically going to go in green. And then purple is for a series slash list of authors' points slash arguments. I'm going to give you an example a little bit later on of what this will look like. A few other things to keep in mind is that noting things next to the text is very essential. So, this is any sort of thought, comment, either to the author or just in general. So, for example, like if the author is talking just complete and utter nonsense and they're going against everybody else in the field, and you're like, you know what, I want to make a comment on this, this is your chance to do it. Go ahead and highlight it and then just put a little text box next to it. Or you could put like a sticky note. And then anything you want to remember, this is also, you know, key, especially for discussions and essays. That way, when you highlight something and you put like a note, you remember in like what the note is relating to. And then note questions. So it's totally okay to have questions while you're reading. It's pretty much encouraged. That's how you gain critical thinking. But if you don't know something or you want to ask about it in class or you want to ask your professor later, always highlight it, either a specific color or you could put a bunch of question marks next to it. That's usually what I will do. And then for anything that's a super important point, so this is going like beyond pink, like I think is the main point of the entire article, I will go ahead and put a star next to it. You could also put a bunch of exclamation points, whatever works for you. I'm going to go ahead and show you just what this would look like in real life. This is what I'm currently working on. This article is called The Scope of Latino Latina Environmental Studies by um, Devin G. Pena at the University of Washington, in case you're interested. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. The resource con Sorry, let me get my screen closer. The resource conservation dogma of Pinchot and the wilderness preservation ethics of John Muir to the post 1960s radical ideologies framed by the discourses of deep ecological, ecofeminism, ecosocialism, and bioregionalism. I have no idea what this is talking about. I'm really confused. Probably like when I was reading it, you were probably confused. So I put a bunch of question marks because I'm like, I'm going to look at this later. I don't know what this is. And then we also have the EJM, which stands for Environmental Justice Movement, linked economical or economic and social justice issues in a discourse on existing political ecological conditions of crisis, domination, and resistance. I just thought this was an interesting point. And, later on too, when you're just scrolling through your notes, I will only read what's highlighted. So if it's not highlighted, it's not important. I'm not going to look at it later on. So that could be something to keep in mind when you're highlighting. Um, and then we have this last piece, right? Environmental racism is defined as racial discrimination in environmental policymaking and involves the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and the sitting of pollution industries and excluding people of color from the mainstream environmental groups, decision making bodies, commissions, and regulatory bodies. So I highlighted it green, right? Because it says environmental racism is defined as automatically a definition, but on top of that, I thought it was a really interesting point and one that I personally am going to comment on in class, or at least plan to. So that's what why I put the star next to it. And then let's look at another example. So, a social survey of the attitudes of Chicano farmers and ranchers towards environmental issues related to mining and water resources development. So I highlighted it because I was going to make a comment and I wanted to make sure to remember what the comment is relating to. So then I have my comments on the side right there. Chicken X farmers are always in the background of environmental justice issues when they're the ones growing food for us. And in addition, if we go to the Central Valley, many are well versed in the struggle slash discussion of water and its cost slash use. So again, something I either want to talk about in a discussion or in class. Plus, also just kind of my personal notes and things that I will reread when I go back and relook at this piece. I also highlighted the principles of environmental justice have had a profoundly transformative effect on the direction of ecological discourses, the scope of environmental agendas, and the formulation of environmental protection policies. So, this is talking about essentially what principles of environmental justice, like its impact, which is important, right? Impact is important. So I highlighted it for future reference. And then the last piece is the post summit movement focused on the three principal objectives strengthening community based legal, scientific, and political opposition to disproportionate adverse impacts, challenging and transforming environmental racism into the EPA and the mainstream environmental organizations. That is the right. And then in the next page, I probably have more highlighted in purple. But anytime I see a colon, right, which is like those two dots after objectives, that is when I will highlight it purple because the author is listing something out. So now we're going to talk about the fundamentals of long notes. So this would be for anything like a lecture or a textbook. So, are there any key words which would usually be in bold, or your professor before they get into lecture, one of their first slides will be to note keywords? Always define them either as you go through the lecture or the book, or at the end. But keywords are keywords for a reason. They're either going to be on the test, the quiz, exam, something. And then are there reoccurring things slash topics? So if you talked about something before, but you're talking about it now, that's probably important, right? They really want to drill it into your head so that you remember, and that way you are better equipped for the exam or the test. And then numbers are important. So anything to do with dates, money, population, anything to do percentages, anything to do with numbers, I will automatically write them down because in one shape or another, it's it's important information. And then are there any images to include? This is especially important for like the sciences. So if you're in biology, right, it's important to be able to visually see where the mitochondria is in the cell, as well as just in general, if you're a visual learner, maybe a Venn diagram is a little bit easier for you to, you know, make sense of than just making out a list. Lastly, we're going to go ahead and talk about shorthand keys. So, shorthand key is essentially like, well, shorthand, right? Writing shorthand is just how you're going to take notes a lot faster. So the first one is delta. So, right, in Greek, a triangle means delta, delta equals change. So a lot of times people will write a triangle to mean change. I personally don't use it. Some people do, but it's an option. And you can do that for other symbols, right? You can like make up your own thing or, write sigma for something, anything you want to do. The thing that I do is abbreviate words. So instead of government, I'll put gov, California, CA, population, pop, Mexico, MX, African American, FM. And then something to always keep in mind, arrows are your friends. Maybe the professor mentions something later on in the lecture that you want to, like, that's related to something earlier in the lecture, I will draw an arrow. Or in this example that I'm giving, maybe they're talking about migration. So, like, people from Mexico are moving to Cuba. So, Mexico, arrow, Cuba, right? Because that's where they're going. And lastly, use symbols. So, the at sign I will use instead of at, because that's just like one less pickup of the pen I have to do. I will use the pound or hashtag instead of number, percent instead of writing percent, dollar, and then instead of writing and, I will put that symbol. And so now I'm going to go ahead and uh, use this and put it into action. So I'm going to go ahead and read you this section about the election of Franklin Roosevelt, and then I'm going to show you how I would take notes on that. So, the election of sorry, let me start again. The election of Franklin Roosevelt. By the 1932 presidential election, Hoover's popularity was at an all time low. Despite his efforts to address the hardships that many Americans faced, his ineffectual response to the Great Depression left Americans angry and ready for change. Franklin Roosevelt, though born to wealth and educated at the best schools, offered the change people sought. His experience in politics had previously included a seat in the New York State legislature, a vice presidential nominee, and a stint as governor of New York. During the latter, he introduced many state level reforms that later formed the basis of his New Deals, as well as worked with several advisors who later formed the brains trust that advised his federal agenda. Next part. Franklin Roosevelt exuded confidence, which the American public desperately wished to see in their leader. And despite his affluence, Americans felt that he could relate to their suffering due to his own physical hardships. He had been struck with polio a decade earlier and was essentially paralyzed from the waist down for the remainder of his life. Roosevelt understood that the public sympathized with his ailments. He likewise developed a genuine uh, empathy for public suffering as a result of his illness. However, he never wanted to be photographed in his wheelchair or appear infirm in any way, for fear that the public sympathy would transform into concern over his physical ability to discharge the duties of the Oval Office. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how I would take notes of this section. So, always, always, always start with the headline. I just used the one from the section on the left, the election of FDR. I'm going to put FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as FDR because it's just shorter, thus shorthand. So, my first point, 1932 election, Hoover no longer popular as pres. In relation to that, because he was, unpopular, was because he was ineffective during the Great Depression. Next point, FDR had XP, experience. And then I listed it, New York State legislator, VP nomination, and then it should be uh, New York governor, just point blank, not almost. He was, my bad. Um, but as governor, he introduced statewide reforms, and then sub, or in relation to that, that was the inspiration for the New Deal. And then while he was governor, he worked with several advisors who later formed Brains Trust. And then the sub there, it advised his federal agenda. Instead of that, I would highly recommend you go to the back of the book into the glossary and just copy what it says there for those bold words, those key terms, because generally that's the direct definition. That's, what will be on test. So it's important to have in your notes. Now, my next point for this section is FDR's image was liked by voters. In relation to that, despite being from wealthy fam, voters could relate to him, and then they could relate to him because FDR had polio and was paralyzed. Because he was paralyzed and had polio, he empathized with the public suffering. But in relation to him having polio and was paralyzed, uh, had no photos in the wheelchair because the wheelchair equaled too weak to do job. So in this example, you can see how I tried and make things as short as possible while still making sense. And I know what I'm talking about. If your notes later on, if you're rereading your notes and you don't know what the heck you're talking about, that means you need to try a different approach on how to take your notes because they should be short, not super short, but shorter than the section, right? And effective. If they're not doing those two things, then you need to reevaluate how you're taking notes and maybe try a different approach. And so, lastly, just some things to remember when taking notes for lecture. PowerPoints are guidelines. They are not guides. They are guidelines. They are not guidelines. They are 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 guidelines. Generally, everything that the professor is going to say is not going to be on the PowerPoint, just as everything I'm saying right now is not a point on the PowerPoint you're watching. And so it's important if they're making any points past what's on the PowerPoint to note them down. Another thing is, I'm going to keep saying it, always write down anything number related, dates, percentage, money, population. It is generally always important. I'd say like 80% of the time. So the majority of the time. Only write the things that stick out to you. So if your professor is rambling and they're kind of just not saying anything, don't take notes of that. Um, but if they're talking about reasons for something happening, so for example, they're talking about how World War II happened, right? Like, what were the reasons? You want to note that down, as well as laws, acts, deals. So if we were learning about the Great New Deal, right, that FDR put into action, always write those things down as well because that's usually going to be asked on the test. Always write down definitions. So if your professor gives you the definition of something, I by default write it down. And then last point, which I think a lot of people get scared to do, but you really shouldn't, right? Because your professor is there to teach you. Is always ask the professor to repeat something if needed. And in turn, maybe you're asking a question that a lot of other people had, but they're too scared to ask. And likewise, if somebody else is asking your professor to reiterate something or, repeat something, then I would sometimes write it down because maybe they caught something that I didn't necessarily catch. Something else maybe that could be interesting to you or would be more effective is get a group of people within the same class and have like a Google Doc of notes that everybody contributes to. And that way you kind of never miss anything because everybody is writing down everything. And that way, if you like miss class, it's no big deal because you already have the notes. Just something I personally don't do it, but I know it's very helpful for classes that are more general ed. All that being said, I really, really, really hope this presentation was helpful for and to you. I know note taking is very intimidating and very hard when you first start, but it's one of those skills where the more you practice it, the better you get. And no better time than the present to get started. Um, and the PowerPoints are as guidelines. So like those are the fundamentals of note taking. And then you just kind of like insert other little points the professor talks about. But always practice. Don't be scared of it. Don't be scared to change up your note taking too. If it's not working for you, it's not working for you. Maybe you need to try a different approach. That's perfectly okay. If you do, however, have any questions, comments, want to talk to me or any other mentor, about how to properly take notes, or maybe you want to show us your notes and get some feedback, you guys are more than welcome to do that. Feel free to message us by email, the SJSU email, or Canvas, and then our office hours are available on Canvas as well as the Zoom link to our office hours. Just something to know: office hours are completely for you guys. If we give you office hours, for example, from 2 to 4, you're welcome to come at 3, you're welcome to come at 2:15. You don't have to stay for the entire time. It's just for you guys to come and ask any type of questions you guys had, because at the end of the day, we're here for you. We want to help you succeed. And we're here because we wish that we had mentors when we were undergrads. And this is just our way of giving back to you guys. So, again, hope this was helpful. Please message us if you need any help. Thank you.